Hello and welcome to this third session on data-driven analysis. In this section, we'll be talking about sentiment analysis. The sentiment analysis node in PolyAnalyst can be considered either a data-driven or an analyst-driven analysis tool, depending on how you use it. And while this node technically uses rules that our developers have created, there are also several built-in default features in this node that do not require analyst inputs and decisions. And it's these built-in features which make it a very helpful tool for data-driven analysis. So let's go over how we can use the sentiment analysis node when our purpose is to gain an overview of our dataset. Now, you may have heard sentiment analysis referred to as sentiment detection or opinion mining. In other words, sentiment analysis is where we use natural language processing and text analysis to try to identify positive and negative expressions about people, objects, events, and other entities. And in PolyAnalyst, the sentiment analysis node is a fully developed, complete tool that handles all these tasks for us. Now, there are multiple features of this node that make it a useful data-driven analysis tool. First, the sentiment analysis node assigns context that's based on word relationships and not just proximity when it makes a sentiment determination in text data. And this is important because sometimes the same word has different meanings in different contexts. So for example, consider how the word low is negative when we're talking about a low quality. But when in the context of discussing a low price, the word low is considered a positive sentiment. And this is just one example of why considering both word relationships and word proximity provides higher accuracy when we're trying to understand the context and sentiment of a statement. The sentiment analysis node also assigns a sentiment degree. And this is important because not all sentiment is equal. After all, a statement like "the food is good" is not as strong of a sentiment as "the food is amazing." Additionally, the node groups the sentiment evaluations into topics, or what we call aspects. And the reason this is important is because we all have different ways of talking about the same thing. So if there are mentions of associates, agents, and customer service representatives in association with various sentiments, we might want to consider these all as staff members and group the associated sentiments together. And the sentiment analysis node in PolyAnalyst does this for us by using semantic dictionaries to find the umbrella terms, or the hypernyms as we call them in linguistics, for various words and topics. So using semantic dictionaries like this removes the need for us to manually group these related topics when we encounter them. And this is particularly helpful when we just want to get a quick overview of the sentiments in our text data. And finally, this node gives us the option to choose a general sentiment analysis or a domain-specific sentiment analysis. And this added capability improves both the accuracy and relevance of our results, since, for example, the types of topics you may encounter in customer reviews about a restaurant would typically differ substantially from the topics you'd see in the reviews about a bank or an insurance provider. Now, in most PolyAnalyst versions, there are 4 built-in sentiment analysis domains available: finance, insurance, restaurants, and technology. But some of the newer versions of PolyAnalyst also include a hospitality sentiment analysis domain. Now, our expressions of sentiment are usually about a person, an object, an event, or in other words, an entity. So, in order to assign sentiment to these entities with higher accuracy, we first need to identify those entities. And this is why it's highly recommended that you use the entity extraction node before the sentiment analysis node to help with your analysis. Now, the entity extraction node in PolyAnalyst comes with several out-of-the-box popular entities that we're usually interested in recognizing, such as people, companies, amounts, locations, and so on. And if this is something you'd like to know more about, you can watch the advanced training videos where we explain all about how the entity extraction node works and what you can do to customize it. But for the time being, the entity extraction node will serve as a parent node to the sentiment analysis node, where we'll just use the out-of-the-box default entity extraction settings. Now, let's try some hands-on practice with the sentiment analysis node. For this hands-on practice section, we will again be working with the hotel reviews dataset that we used in the previous sessions on data-driven analysis. So let's see how we can use the sentiment analysis node to get an overview of this data. Now, as we just mentioned earlier, it's highly recommended that we use an entity extraction node as the parent node for the sentiment analysis node. So we'll do that first. Let's find the entity extraction node in the node panel. Now let's drag it into our workspace and connect it to the index node here. Now in this situation, we don't need to configure any of the node properties since we just want this node to identify all the out-of-the-box built-in entities to help with our sentiment analysis. So let's go ahead and execute the node. Now that the node is executed, let's take a quick look at the results before we move on to sentiment analysis. So here's a preview of all the types of information that we can extract from the data with just one click. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this feature, you can check out our advanced training series videos where we go into more details on how to configure and customize the entity extraction node. But for now, we'll continue going over how to use the sentiment analysis node for data-driven analysis. Now, let's bring in the sentiment analysis node. And let's go ahead and connect it to the entity extraction node. Now, because we're using the sentiment analysis node as an out-of-the-box solution, the only setting we would need to check is whether we're using the general sentiment analysis or a domain-specific option. So let's go into the node properties. Now, in the Sentiments tab at the bottom here, we're going to verify the sentiment domain settings. And we can see that if we click the drop-down menu, we can select from a few different options. Now for this exercise, we'll just leave the default general option checked for our dataset. So let's execute the node and take a look at our results. So let's now open the node and view the results. So when we first open the results view, we can see the Summary tab with multiple panels. Now on the left, we have the aspects or topics that were identified and their associated overall sentiment. For example, we can see that overall, the customers are happy with the hotels in this data set. However, there are also certain aspects that aren't so good, such as food and beverages, bonuses and fees, location, and security. Now, if we want to get a better look at one of these aspects, we can click on it and see some more details. For example, let's look at food and beverage. And when we click on this, we can see in this panel over here to the right that PolyAnalyst has identified a number of items in this topic, such as breakfast, food, dinner, coffee, and so on. And we can see right away which items within this topic have an overall positive or overall negative evaluation based on the color in the cell of each of these head objects. Now, the head objects are what PolyAnalyst has identified to be the keywords for the evaluations of this aspect. And for each head object, we can see how many records have a negative evaluation and how many have a positive evaluation. And in this column here, we can also see the average sentiment degree for each of the head objects. And the sentiment degree has a scale from +5 to -5 to help us capture the nuances of sentiment in the text data. And similar to the other nodes in PolyAnalyst, we can drill down to see these positive or negative evaluations in the text of the actual records. For example, let's click on the negative evaluations for breakfast. And we look over here to the panel on the right, we now see all the associated records with negative assessments on the breakfast. Now, if we want more information about each sentiment evaluation, we also have a table view of this analysis. And we can see this if we switch to the Sentiments tab. Now, in this tab, the default positive and negative sentiments are listed like this, so we can view the evaluations of each text statement in this manner if we choose. But the best way to get a quick overview of the sentiments in our data is by switching to this graph view here. Now, this tab summarizes the sentiment analysis results in a link graph where we can see the different aspects and the keywords of those aspects that were identified in the dataset. And it also includes the overall positive or negative evaluations for each of these as signified by the color-coded lines. Now, the thickness of the connecting lines here, it indicates the number of records where this evaluation was captured. And once we click on a specific aspect and a keyword and even a specific sentiment, we can again drill down to the associated records. And you'll notice that the tools for the graph here are the same ones you see with the link terms node as far as manipulating the graph view. But we'll just leave these settings alone for now. So the next question we might have is, what can we do with all these results here? Well, one thing we can do is go back to the Summary tab, and we can click the Generate button here. And once we do that, we can see that we have a few options. First, we can choose to generate a taxonomy as the basis for a more fine-tuned, analyst-driven analysis. We can also generate a dataset that will include the sentiment information for each record in a tabular format. Or if we want to present the results of this analysis, we can directly generate an interactive graph like the one we just viewed in the Graph tab of this node, and then we can just add it to our web report if we choose. But we'll go into more about web reports in another video. For now, we can just exit this node and continue with our analysis. Thanks for watching this third session on data-driven analysis. Next up, we'll be going over PDL basics.